Hello everyone, and thank you so much for clicking and for your interest. I am Irina on Facebook, better known as Verðandi. I recently launched a page where I post from my readings and investigations, and this will be my attempt at a channel, a podcast rather, dealing with topics from the areas related to the Viking Age, Old Norse religion, Germanic peoples, and similar stuff. I have been studying over the years, and I have recently resumed my investigations. I have a PhD in Nordic studies and a master's degree in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. So, well, I thought that it would be interesting if I also display the results of my little investigations, and generally I will be attempting a tone somewhere between entertaining and academic, so yeah, suitable for YouTube videos. I hope that you will enjoy and that you will like it, so that I can get inspired to make more such podcasts. So I thought today we might as well be talking about the creation myth in Old Norse religion, with reference especially to the first beings that appear. And for this, I will be using, as in many of my videos, dealing with the topic Old Norse religion, the sources, the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda. So before we start talking about this very interesting topic, I would like to first point out the difference between these two sources and why they are so important to us. So the Poetic Edda is a collection of poems written in the mid-1200s by different authors, and the poems, although they were written in the 13th century, they are dated back to the 900s. Some of them are really old. They have been preserved in oral tradition, and based on linguistic evidence, certain archaic traits, alliterations, copying errors, consonants, for example, at the beginning of the word, which were lost, but without which alliteration cannot function. So rhyme at the beginning of the words cannot function. We can actually tell that these poems were much older than in the day they were copied by Christian scribes. It's also noteworthy that these poems preserve basically the stories related to Norse gods and heroes as well, because we have a collection of mythological poems and a collection of heroic poems. There is very little related to ritual. Yeah, most of them are like stories that the scribes thought well, perhaps interesting for the others to read, so that they can stay connected to the past, maybe. The other Edda, the Prose Edda or the younger Edda, this one probably has an author, most probably, by the name of Snorri Sturluson or Sturluson in the modern pronunciation, the famous Icelandic scholar, author and chieftain who attempted to write a book for the poets of his age. He also wrote the book in the 12th, in the 13th century, so in the probably at the beginning, or in the first half of the 13th century, 20 most probably, and his main purpose with this was to create kind of like a textbook for poets of his time, because he was under the correct impression that these old forms of poetry, of Viking poetry, were beginning to become forgotten. Now they were falling into oblivion and being replaced by more European types of poetry, that poetry with the rhyme at the end, or yeah, several types of romances that were popular in Europe in the Middle Ages. So he created this textbook basically, and he could not explain the creation, how to create poetry without explaining the mythological lore that was specific to this type of poetry, because Old Norse poetry is full, not only Eddic poetry, but also skaldic poetry is full of such mythological references. Snorri's source, however, is to be considered a secondary source because although he quotes massively both from the Poetic Edda and from other poems, which unfortunately have been lost with the passage of time, he wants to present everything like a very coherent, very solid story, while Norse mythology was by far a coherent story. It was probably transmitted into different versions. Many details were lost. And he was probably also trying to make sense of all the contradictory pieces of information that he was finding. However, it is still an invaluable source because although he lived, well, 300 years after the initial poems, the Eddic poems, were written, he still knew quite a lot about this mythology. He probably had access to a lot of texts, and without his work, it would be much more difficult for us to make sense of what is written in the Poetic Edda, for example. So we are going to use these two sources to comment on the topic, but keeping in mind that the Poetic Edda is the basic source, the more archaic one, the one closer to, the way the myths were actually circulating back in the day, and we're going to consider Snorri's source as being a secondary source. So, like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about the beginning of the world in Norse mythology. We should start by saying that there was a void. There was a void by the name of Ginnungagap. Ginnungagap would mean something like the void that is yawning, the yawning void. We have referenced this both in the first poem of the Poetic Edda, the Völuspá, and in the first section of Snorri's Edda in the Gylfaginning. Now, this first section of Snorri's Prose Edda presents the more detailed version of the creation myth. Basically, we have two realms. One, the watery realm, known as Niflheimr, would translate something like the misty realm. Heimr is the word for world, that would come to be the word for home as well. On the other hand, we have Muspel or Muspelheimr in some versions, later versions. This would be the fiery region. So between these regions, there is this yawning void, the Ginnungagap, or as it's told in Völuspá, Ginnungavassgap. It so happens that from a well, from a spring that is in Niflheimr, called Hvergelmir, one of the three major wells in this mythology, standing at the roots of the world tree. So besides Hvergelmir, we have the Urðarbrunner and the Mimisbrunner. From this spring, water begins to flow, and it meets the fiery region, or the sparks fired from Muspel, and they are starting to freeze. And the first being is created. So from the intersection, if you will, of these two realms, we have Ymir. Ymir, he is said to be the first frost giant, or Hrimthurs. Thurs is a word which is, well, almost the same as Jotun, yeah, so giant, a frost giant Hrim. Um, this could mean literally that he was made out of ice. It could also be a term mainly used for poetic purposes to alliterate with some other words. This was a pretty common thing to do in old Viking poetry, like to invent some words, some longer words, so that you can have something to rhyme with from a different verse. So we have this frost giant called Ymir. He is also known by the name of Aurgelmir in a different poem, the poem of Vafthrudismal. And from this giant, the whole world will be created. And we're going to see in a minute how. Etymologically, it might happen that this word has something to do with the twin. It's uncertain. We also have a reference in Tacitus about some Germanic peoples believing in some primordial being called twin. So this might be a connection, but then again, we must be careful when we use very old sources about Germanic peoples when talking about Norse mythology, because both the time and the space are quite different. Yeah, so between Tacitus and Voluspor, for example, so the Poetic Edda, we do have a gap of a couple hundred years. So this is important to remember. All right. So besides Ymir, what other beings do we have? Well, we have a proto-cow, if you will, a primordial cow by the name of Audhumla. This cow is very, very important in the creation myth for two reasons. First of all, because she gives the life-giving milk to Ymir. And the second reason would be the fact that while licking the blocks of salty ice, she brings to life another creature named Buri, who will be the ancestor of the main family of gods known as the Aesir. So Aesir is the main family of gods. You have gods like, Odin and Thor and Tyr and all the very well-known gods. The singular form, by the way, is Os. And then you have the Jotnar. These would be the giants, which might be considered as some kind of family of anti-gods. Giant does not always mean of massive dimensions. Yeah, so sometimes it can just mean, a different family, maybe an inferior family of gods, but the gods and giants do have relationships to one another, creating mixed beings. Odin himself was part giant. Yeah. Okay. So I tried to make here a little scheme with the first beings, the first creatures from this cosmogonic myth, sorry. And let me explain a little bit. So from Ymir, we have the family of giants. Now, of course, there is the question how Ymir could have created by himself all this stuff. In the poem of Vafthrudismal, where Odin talks to the very wise giant Vafthrudnir, he explains it by saying, well, something that will sound a bit ridiculous, but you know, these mythological stories, they always have far-fetched solutions for this kind of problem. He goes on to say that from the sweat of the giant and from the intercourse that his legs are engaged in, he gives birth to all kinds of jötnar. For example, he gives birth to Bolthor, or in Snorri's version, Bolthorn. In Snorri's version, it would actually mean a mischievous thorn. Yeah, Bol is like mischief, evil. And in his turn, Bolthorn will have a daughter called Bestla. All right, on the other hand, we have Buri, so the first from the family of the Aesir, who will be engaged in intercourse with an unnamed giantess, and the result will be someone called Bur or Bor, depending on the source. It's actually a more generic name for son. And from the marriage of Bestla and Bor, we have the three gods, Odin, Vili, and Ve. Odin, Vili, and Ve. They will be the ones to create the world out of Ymir's body. So what they're going to do is kill their ancestor, Ymir, and make the world out of the different parts of his body. And I'm going to quote a little bit of that story. I'm going to quote from Vafthrudnismál from stanza 21. Let's see. Or Ymis holdi var jörð of skopuð, en or beinum björg, himin or hausi, ens hrimkalda jötns, en or sveita sær. So out of Ymir's flesh, the earth was created, and out of his bones, the mountains. The sky was created out of his skull, and from the frost giant was created the ocean out of his blood. A more detailed version is in Snorri's Prose Edda, as expected. So for example, Ymir's eyebrows are used to create the world of men. Midgarder. Midgarder meaning an enclosure, an encirclement, so it is a very protected space, and his eyebrows act as a fence to protect the world of men against all kinds of evil, specifically the giants who live beyond the outer ocean. The dwarves as well are created out of Ymir's rotten flesh. They are the maggots that come out of his flesh. His brains become the clouds, for example. So, as I said, Ymir, the killing of Ymir produces the world. We can also find correspondences in other mythologies with a creature being, murdered in order for this world to be born. Let's see what happens next. So, the first human beings, maybe we should mention them as well. The first human beings are created by this is here we have a difference, because in the Poetic Edda we have the three gods that are responsible for giving life to humans, called Odin, Hönir, and Lothur. On the other hand, in the Prose Edda of Snorri, we have Odin and his brothers. Yeah, so Odin, Vili, and Ve who are doing this. Now, it is very possible that different traditions were circulating, and Snorri just picked up the one who was which was talking about Odin and his brothers. Hunir is a very mysterious character in Norse mythology. He appears to be somehow related to birds, and he doesn't really play a big part in mythology. He does survive the Ragnarök, but other than that, a very, very enigmatic presence. Lothar, on the other hand, could be interpreted as Loki, because this trio of gods, so Odin, Hönir, and Loki, appear in other stories, particularly in the story of Regensmol, in the story related in the poem Regensmol, a heroic poem which talks about the three gods who walk one day and capture this otter-looking creature that they kill, and then they trigger a series of events that will eventually lead to the famous hero Sigurd killing the dragon Fofnir. But that's a different story that we'll be discussing in another video. Coming back to this story, so we have these three gods, Odin, Hönir, and Lothar. They are walking on the shore, and they endow with life two beings by the name of Asker and Embla. Asker, it is the ash tree. Embla, it's very unclear, but it might be the elm tree, although it's a bit far-fetched etymology. Either way, these two beings, when they find them, they are fateless, urloklaus. So urlok is one of the words used in Old Norse for fate. They endow them with wit, with spirit, and with their physical appearance. And Snorri adds the detail that these two were actually pieces of wood. Yeah, so they were driftwood. An ash tree is also the world tree, or the fate tree, as it is called in Völuspá. Yggdrasil interpreted as the horse of Odin, although here as well it is a bit of an etymological controversy. This tree, which is also, like I said, an ash tree, has three roots, and a lot of things happen at these three roots. Let me find some reference in the poem Grimnismol. This is another poem from the Poetic Edda, and beginning with stanza 29, we have some details about it. So, all right, beginning with stanza 29, it says here that the god Thor will have to cross 4 rivers every day when he goes to meetings at the tree Yggdrasil. Then we have some mention of the bridge, the rainbow bridge Bifrost, linking the world of men with the world of the gods, with Oscar. Then we have more reference to some rivers, Glath and Gullir, Gler, Sleipnir, and so on. Again, a mention of the gods of Oscar. They're riding their horses every day across these rivers when they have to meet at the tree Yggdrasil. So we can see that this is a very important meeting point, perhaps a judgment place where the gods gather. And the tree has 3 roots. They grow in 3 directions, and we have a root in hell. So in the underworld, we have another root in the realm of giants, so in Jotunheimr, and we have another root in the realm of men, so in Midgardr. And then we have all kinds of creatures, almost torturing this tree, or yeah, at least living in it. We have the squirrel named Ratatosk running around, running up and down. We also have an eagle, and we also have a serpent creature, Nidhogg, gnawing on the tree. We have 4 deer stretching their necks and eating the leaves of Yggdrasil. A lot of serpents. Yeah, we have the sons of the snake Grafvitnir, for example, of the great wolf or the great snake. So a lot of monsters in this tree. Yeah, so this is basically the linking point of all these worlds, and besides the gods making judgments at his roots, we also have the Nornir. The Nornir, so, or the Moirai. Yeah, so they're the Norse correspondents of the Greek Moirai. They're called Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, and they are deciding the fates of all men and of all gods. And let me quote from Voluspor, stanza 20, a little bit. So it says in stanza 20, Þaðan koma meyjar, margs vitandi, þrjár or þeimshe, und þoli stendur, urð hetu eina, aðra verðandi, skoru og skíði, skuld ena þriðju, þeir logðu, þeir líf kuru, alda bornum, urlok segja. So the maidens are coming. They are all-knowing, so or they know a lot. They come out of a certain body of water, and they are standing under a tree. One of them is called Urð, the other is called Verdandi, the third one is called Skuld, and they are carving on a plank, skoru or skíði. So they are not weaving as the more popular image would have you believe. This is, I would say, a contamination from Greek mythology. No, they're carving, actually. They're carving on wood sticks. They're carving runes, most probably. They are also laying laws. They're passing laws, and they are choosing lives for all the sons of men, and they are, deciding the fates of men. Örlog. It is noteworthy to mention here at the end that in Norse mythology, the concept of fate is a very, how should I put it? It's a very absolute concept, so nobody can escape the fates decided by the Nornir, not even the god Odin, who is trying desperately to cheat fate by gathering all the best of warriors in his hall in Valhall. All right, so there you go, a couple of basic information about the first beings that populate the earth in Norse mythology. In the next videos, I will be going into detail with reference to some of these topics, and I hope that you can follow me and support me in what I'm doing. Check out my page on Facebook. You are going to find a lot of interesting articles if you're interested in Norse mythology, and not only in general topics related to Scandinavia, to Germanic languages, and to the early Middle Ages, Germanic peoples, and so on. Yeah, so I'll see you around. Take care, and thanks a lot for listening. All the best.